your readings this week, we're shifting to thinking more concretely about the writing process. This may have been something you covered in English 103, but it's useful to think about it again as we head into starting the research paper. At this point, you've, in theory, got most of your research proposal and annotated bibliography, and that will be what turns into your research paper. So there will be a video next week to introduce the project to you, but as we mentioned before, you will have to write between 2,000 to 3,000 words. That's a departmental requirement, not some arbitrary number I made up. And when students hear that number, it feels like a lot. And some folks have never written that many words before, which can make the project feel intimidating. However, by focusing on the writing process, we can break that word count down into smaller, more manageable pieces. In the Pillow Fort Studios video that you watched this week, they talked about the 5-step writing process. If you chose to read the Donald Murray reading on process instead of product, you'll see that he chose to include 3 steps in the writing process. Anne Lamott also follows a 3-step process, but hers are different from Murray's, as evidenced by the distinct lack of curse words in Murray's text. In the video, they cover pre-writing, drafting, revision, editing, and publishing. Something that really sticks out to me in the video is how they point out that you may be moving through all of these steps in a recursive way, or a way in which you're moving back and forth. This is really natural in the writing process. When we get to revision, we may notice that something in the pre-writing phase got skipped, like some preliminary research. This might be frustrating, but if we want an effective text, it's worth going back and adjusting. Murray posits that there are only 3 steps in the writing process: pre-writing, writing, and rewriting. He argues that we spend the most time, a whopping 85% of our time, in that first phase. It's a very nebulous thing, as he points out, that daydreaming is included as pre-writing. Now, with Anne Lamott, my students either tend to love or hate this reading from her. Some find her incredibly relatable and funny, and others cringe at her lack of sensitivity or what may be interpreted as an irreverent perspective of writing. She coins the first phase of her writing process as the down draft, or the shitty first draft, where the goal is to just get everything written down. Then she moves into the up draft, where she fixes it up. And finally, she gets to the dental draft, where she's going in depth into each and every single part of the writing to see what needs to be changed. We might think of this in other terms as drafting, revision, and editing. You're really getting an insight into my brain as a teacher with these readings. I chose these specifically to try and help lessen the fear that might come with writing a research paper. I really value you discovering a writing process that works for you. And as Murray suggests, I expect you to move through the process and look for places to improve your writing, as opposed to expecting some perfect piece of writing at the end. And that's reflected in our grading scale. As long as you're meeting the basic requirements I've laid out for you, there's no need to worry about submitting the most perfect research proposal or annotated bibliography or research paper that you've ever completed. I encourage you to take pride in your work and to submit something that you've worked hard on, but don't let that idea of perfection paralyze you in the writing process. And if you hate writing, it might be worth considering making some changes to your process. The readings this week presented it in a very straightforward way as a series of steps. So perhaps this is useful to you. Perhaps it feels restrictive, and you don't like it, and that's okay. But I want to talk about other things that we can do to develop our writing process so that things are perhaps slightly more enjoyable whenever you sit down to write. Something that I tend to find helpful when I write is to think about process in a sensory way. We have 5 senses as human beings, right? Sight, smell, taste, touch, and hearing. Incorporating the senses into our writing process can be a fun way to adjust things. So for instance, when I sit down to write, I like to have something for each of my senses. And it can differ depending on the day, but here are some things that you can do for each sense. With sight, Where is somewhere that you can focus on your writing? Do you have a favorite room or a favorite place to study? What's easier to look at while you write? A computer screen or paper? Do you need to turn off the lights and work in a darker space? Can you work with other people around without getting distracted? For smell, can you burn a favorite candle? Spray a room spray. Open the windows. Open the windows and let the scents from outside kind of waft in. Do you feel better and more productive after a shower where you feel and smell clean? When it comes to taste, are you hungry? Do you need a snack? Would having an emotional support water bottle or a can of pop be helpful? Are you somebody who likes to chew gum or a mint? With touch, are you comfortable? Would you work better with a blanket or in bed? Are you someone who needs to sit at a desk for that structure? Do you need to leave your phone in another room or put it on do not disturb so it's not vibrating or ringing while you're trying to write? For hearing, right? Are you someone who likes to listen to music? Or do you need as close to silence as you can get? Maybe you work better with a TV show on in the background. And it might not always be the perfect situation, but if we pay attention to our bodies while we write and we take care of what our body needs, then we may have a better experience with writing. For me, lately, as I've written the scripts for these videos, I've enjoyed sitting on my couch in the living room. I can look out the front window, and I have plenty of sunshine and natural light that comes in usually. I like to work on my laptop, which is a departure from how I typically write, but that's what's working best for me right now. I do have an air freshener down there, but sometimes I like to burn a candle, and I swap out the candles in the scents that I have with each season, so it always matches the vibe that I'm seeing out the window. And I won't usually eat while I'm writing, but I like to make myself a coffee. I'm really into cold brew with a sugar-free s'mores flavor right now. And I keep my phone near me, but I put it on the back of the couch so that way I won't get too distracted. I like to have a blanket while I work. And sometimes I like to have the TV on in the background and I listen to shows like The West Wing, which is the greatest TV show of all time, or the Great British Baking Show. If I choose to listen to music, I typically like Taylor Swift instrumental or Tyler Childers. But lately though, I have been working in near silence where I can just hear the birds chirping outside. So feel free to make the writing process your own, right? Adapt to your needs, your preferences. Once we get comfortable, we get to actually start writing. So you may have been introduced to outlines in the past, and it seems like a lot of high schools require students to submit outlines as part of a grade. Personally, when I'm drafting a piece of writing, I go for an outline. I like to physically write it down on paper, and then I go through 3 or 4 different outline drafts to plan out my writing. It's the way that my brain works the best. It feels like a way to map everything out and kind of break it down into specific pieces. However, though, right, outlines can feel restrictive or uncreative for people, and that's okay, right? Your process is your own. So if you've found in the past that outlines don't work for you in the traditional way, you can try something else to plan your writing. Mind maps are another popular tool. You can draw these out on a piece of paper. You can make them in Canva. You can use a specific mind mapping software like Padlet. I'll link to that in the description so you can try it out if you'd like. In mind mapping, though, people essentially use bubbles to connect ideas. So for something like a research paper, you might start with your thesis or research question in the center bubble, and then each spoke from the center could be a different body paragraph, or maybe you want to organize it and each bubble is a source. But it can be a helpful way to physically see the connections between your different sources, which can help contribute to the flow of your overall research paper. Or you might just take Lamott's approach and write everything that comes to mind. So your first draft might be 6,000 words long because you just write all of the thoughts that enter your brain, whether it's directly related to your research or not. If we choose to follow Lamont, though, we need to go back and revise that possibly shitty first draft. Revision is always important, but especially in a situation like that where you're just putting anything in. But no matter what method we choose to draft our work, it's important that we focus on just writing first, right? And you can go back and edit later. Like the video you watched for this week says, your brain can't effectively create and edit language at the same time. So if you typically write in a way where you're editing as you go, I encourage you to take a break from that process and try a new method instead. I know it's hard. I used to write that way too, and it was really difficult to break myself out of that habit, but it's worth it, right? You will probably find that it takes less time to write and to get a final draft when you stop trying to edit as you go. So, how do we actually go about writing this research paper once we finish the research proposal and annotated bibliography? The video you watched outlines a process for about a month, but we don't have the exact same luxury of time in a class of this length. So we've got about 20 days from when the research paper is first officially assigned and when it's due. Now, you do have the option to take an extension on the project if you need a few extra days. That policy is outlined in our syllabus. But if you used that on the first project, or you plan to use that on the first project, it will be gone for the second one. So maybe you would also choose to use it for the third project, the multimodal one, and you don't want to waste the extension on the research paper. All of that is your choice. That is up to you. But because of the elements that we have at play here, we'll plan our work for 20 days. So from the 2nd until the 22nd. And remember, right, you set a timeline for yourself in the research proposal, so you can use this video to inspire that, or you can just use the timeline that you wrote for the research proposal already. So the paper officially gets assigned on June 2nd. Since you have your research topic already, and you have most of your sources, I'd begin by finding your last couple of sources. So remember, you need 4 submitted for the annotated bibliography, but you need 6 by the time you submit the research paper. So I'd have all of your sources found no later than June 6th. And from there, you can start drafting. So maybe you give yourself a week to draft following one of the methods that we talked about a minute ago, whether that's outlining, mind mapping, word vomit, all of them work. And so then this would take us to June 13th, and then you can get into revision. So remember that you have a peer review assignment to do. The other video posted this week was about peer review. So maybe during this revision phase is when you would like to schedule an appointment with the Writing Center, and you can work on revising while also knocking out a minor assignment for this class to kill 2 birds with 1 stone. But either way, if you give yourself a week to revise, that'll take us to June 20th. Then you've got a couple of days to do any fine tuning and editing, and you can submit it by the deadline of June 22nd. Okay, we've covered a lot of different concepts in this video. How does all of this connect to the outside world? Well, number 1, being aware of how we work best is something that can influence our productivity in a professional setting and in a personal way. Understanding that we can also experiment with new ways of working can help us to find the style that best works for us. And being able to plan out our work can help hold us more accountable, and it can contribute to positive time management skills. If you struggle with procrastination, as many students have mentioned so far in their goal setting responses, things like this can be helpful at reprogramming that habit. All right, so that's it for this week's video lecture. If you have a unique take on the writing process that might help your classmates, I encourage you to post something on the catch-all discussion board about it. And if you have any questions about the readings, the lecture, or the expectations for assignments like peer review, you can post them on the catch-all discussion board.